And what's your call sign, ma'am? Blue Rinse? Silver Fox? The condescending question, dripping with the casual cruelty of youth, echoed across the polished floor of the ready room, each word a carefully aimed dart of dismissive arrogance. The crowd, a sea of olive-drab flight suits and cocky smiles, laughed. It was a low, rolling chuckle, the sound of a pack affirming its hierarchy, a collective endorsement of the mockery aimed at the small, elderly woman standing near the briefing screen. She was a ghost in this world of high-G turns and sonic booms, a relic of a bygone era misplaced among the gleaming, futuristic technology of the USS Vigilance. Her tweed jacket, sensible shoes, and the quiet way she held her hands clasped before her were a stark, almost comical contrast to the swagger of Lieutenant Commander Alex Viper Jensen, the squadron's golden boy, whose questions still hung in the air like the scent of ozone after a lightning strike. But the woman, Evelyn Reed, offered no reaction. Her face, a roadmap of 80 years of life, remained a mask of serene neutrality. Her pale blue eyes, clear and calm, did not flinch or narrow in anger. She simply stood her ground, a silent, unmovable island in a river of youthful vanity, her posture one of quiet observation. She was listening, not to the insult, but to the hum of the carrier around her, to the deep, resonant pulse of the ship's heart. But when the carrier strike group commander, Rear Admiral Marcus Thorne, who had been observing from the back of the room, saw her stance, the subtle shift of weight to the balls of her feet, the perfectly straight line of her spine, a posture of readiness he hadn't seen in 50 years, a flicker of something ancient and powerful, a ghost of a memory, stirred in the depths of his mind. He saw not a frail old woman, but the coiled potential of a weapon at rest. If you believe that true strength is measured not in boasts but in deeds, and that respect is an honor that must be earned through silent, unwavering competence, type competence below. The source of Viper's derision was, in his mind, entirely justified. Evelyn Reed had been introduced by a civilian liaison as a Department of the Navy consultant here to observe their new, state-of-the-art Aegis 6 combat simulator. To Viper and his squadron, the saints of war, she was just another bureaucrat, a pencil pusher sent from Washington to justify a budget, completely oblivious to the visceral reality of their profession. They lived on the knife's edge, a world of controlled violence and split-second decisions, and her presence felt like an intrusion, a desecration of their sacred space. The briefing continued, detailing the parameters of the day's training scenario, a catastrophic multi-system failure in the new, experimental F-31 Wyvern, an aircraft so advanced it was still largely classified. The simulation was designed to be a crucible, a test of pure airmanship under impossible conditions. The scenario is designated Kobayashi Maru 20, the briefing officer stated, a grim smile on his face. It's designed to be unwinnable. Your objective is not to succeed, but to extend survival time and data collection as long as possible before impact, Viper scoffed audibly. Unwinnable was a challenge, not a fact. He was the best, the pilot with the most traps, the steadiest hands, the coldest nerves. He would be the one to break the machine. He saw Evelyn make a small, almost imperceptible note on a pad she carried, her pen moving with a slow, deliberate grace that he found infuriatingly quaint. Her silence was a judgment. He decided, the quiet disapproval of an outsider who could never comprehend the fire that burned within men like him. He felt the need to provoke, to shatter that infuriating calm and expose her for the irrelevant fossil she was. He was the future, she was the past. And in the cockpit, the past was just dead weight. This belief, this core tenet of his arrogant worldview, was the foundation of his identity. It was a foundation built on the shifting sands of assumption, a structure of ego that was about to be pulverized into dust by a quiet storm he could not possibly see coming. He was so focused on her age, on her civilian clothes, on her gender, that he failed to notice the one detail that mattered, the profound, absolute, and unnerving lack of fear in her eyes. The simulator bay was a technological cathedral, a hushed, climate-controlled space where the gods of aviation were worshipped. The centerpiece was the Aegis 6, a full-motion dome that could replicate any weather condition, any G-force, any conceivable combat scenario with terrifying fidelity. Viper entered it with a familiar swagger, the practiced confidence of a man who considered the cockpit his natural habitat. He strapped in, the harnesses clicking into place like a knight donning his armor. The canopy hissed shut, and the world outside vanished, replaced by a hyper-realistic projection of the carrier deck, the sea churning thousands of feet below. For 10 minutes, he was masterful. He flew the simulated F/A-31 Wyvern with aggression and flair, pushing the envelope, making the bleeding-edge machine dance to his will. Then, the scenario began. A cascade of alarms shrieked through the cockpit. The master caution light flashed with frantic urgency. One by one, his systems began to die. Hydraulics failed. Flight controls went sluggish, then unresponsive. The twin engines sputtered, starved of fuel from a phantom leak. The calm, computerized voice of the aircraft's AI began a relentless, monotone recitation of his doom. Warning, total hydraulic failure. Warning, uncontrolled flameout, port engine. Warning, starboard engine failure imminent. Eject, eject, eject. Viper's confidence began to crack. His breath came in ragged gasps. Sweat beaded on his forehead, stinging his eyes. He fought the controls, his movements becoming frantic, jerky. He was wrestling with a ghost, a machine that refused his commands. The ocean rushed up to meet him, the blue expanse filling the entire canopy. The simulation ended with the sickening, final crunch of impact and a screen that glowed with a single, damning word: failed. He emerged from the simulator, his flight suit soaked, his face pale with a mixture of fury and humiliation. One by one, the other top pilots of the squadron tried. One by one, they all failed. The machine was unbreakable. The scenario was, just as the briefer had said, unwinnable. It was a slaughter. A heavy silence settled over the simulator bay, the thick, cloying quiet of collective defeat. The Saints of War, the pride of the carrier air wing, had been humbled by a string of code. It was then that Viper, his ego raw and bleeding, turned his frustration on the easiest target. He saw Evelyn Reed, standing by the control console, her expression as placid as ever. The sight of her infuriating calm in the face of their failure was too much to bear. "Well, ma'am," he sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like we can't crack it. Maybe you'd like to give it a try? Show us young pups how it's done." The challenge was a joke, a final, public act of humiliation. The other pilots shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to intervene. To their astonishment, Evelyn simply nodded. "I will," she said, her voice soft but clear, devoid of any hint of sarcasm or anger. She handed her notepad to a stunned technician and walked towards the simulator with a steady, unhurried gait. Viper let out a bark of incredulous laughter. The old woman was actually going to do it. This would be perfect. She would last 30 seconds, and her foolishness would erase the sting of his own failure. Evelyn climbed into the cockpit with a practiced ease that was the first subtle clue something was wrong with their assumptions. She didn't fumble with the straps. Her hands moved with an economy and purpose that spoke of deep, ingrained muscle memory. The canopy closed, and the screens flickered to life. The scenario reset, and then the demonstration began. The alarm started screaming almost immediately, the same cascade of failures that had doomed everyone else. But Evelyn's response was utterly different. She didn't fight the machine. She didn't curse or wrestle with the controls. Her hands, wrinkled and marked with age spots, moved with a gentle, fluid precision across the panel. She began systematically shutting down non-essential systems, not in a panic, but with the methodical calm of someone tidying a room. She was conserving power, redirecting the aircraft's dying lifeblood to the few systems that mattered. She ignored the wailing AI, her head cocked slightly as if she were listening to something else entirely. The whisper of the wind over the wings, the groaning protest of the airframe itself. She was flying not by the book, but by feel a primal, instinctive form of airmanship that had been rendered obsolete by generations of fly-by-wire technology. In the control room, the technicians stared at their monitors, their jaws agape. She was performing a dead-stick landing, gliding a powerless, 30-ton brick of advanced composites, something considered a theoretical impossibility in the F/A-31. She wasn't following any known emergency procedure. She was writing a new one, in real time, in the heart of the storm. The simulated carrier deck grew larger on the screen. She was too high, too fast. There was no way she could make it. Then, she did something that defied all logic. She initiated a controlled, side-slipping maneuver, a terrifyingly dangerous aerobatic technique used by barnstormers and bush pilots, bleeding off speed and altitude at a phenomenal rate. The aircraft shuddered violently, protesting the brutal treatment, but she held it steady. With a final, delicate touch, she flared the nose, and the simulated jet settled onto the deck with a gentle chirp of tires, catching the third wire perfectly. The screen glowed with 2 words, "Mission accomplished." A deafening silence, profound and absolute, filled the control room. It was the sound of 100 assumptions shattering at once. Viper Jensen stood frozen, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He uttered a single phrase, a whisper of disbelief that was swallowed by the void. "That's not possible." Rear Admiral Marcus Thorne had seen the impossible before. He had seen it in the skies over Vietnam, in the desperate dogfights of the Cold War, and in the fiery crucible of Desert Storm. But he had never seen anything like this. He watched the telemetry readouts, his mind struggling to process the data. The side-slip maneuver, the precise energy management, the complete disregard for standard procedure in favor of a deeper, more intuitive understanding of flight dynamics. It wasn't the flying of a modern naval aviator. It was the flying of a ghost. A memory, sharp and sudden, pierced the fog of 50 years. He was a young ensign, fresh out of Annapolis, on a tour of a high-desert test facility, a place so secret it was known only by a string of numbers. He remembered seeing a group of pilots, set apart from the regular Air Force and Navy crews. They were different, quieter. They flew strange, experimental aircraft with swept wings and powerful, unstable engines. They were called the Chimeras, and the things they did in the sky were spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. They were the ones who wrote the emergency procedures for everyone else, because they were the ones who experienced the emergencies first. And among them, there was a legend. A pilot so skilled, so preternaturally gifted at coaxing dying machines back to Earth, that they were given a special call sign. A pilot who flew the most dangerous prototypes, the ones that had a tendency to fall out of the sky. He strode over to a secure terminal in the corner of the control room, his face grim. He entered his highest-level security credentials, his fingers flying across the keypad. He accessed the deepest, most heavily classified sections of the Naval Archives, a digital vault of forgotten heroes and Cold War secrets. He typed in a name, Evelyn Reed. The search returned a single file, flagged with warnings of top secret /SCI/no foreign. He opened it. The screen filled with blacked-out paragraphs of redaction, a testament to a career spent in the shadows. But a few lines were visible. Unit, USAF/Navy Joint Experimental Test Wing, Edwards AFB, Project Chimera. Flight hours, 12,000 plus, primarily in X-Series and prototype aircraft. Medals, Distinguished Flying Cross with 4 oak leaf clusters, Presidential Medal of Freedom, classified citation. Status, retired. But it was the last entry that made the Admiral's blood run cold. It was a single line, stark and chilling in its simplicity. Call sign, Wraith. He slowly turned away from the screen, his eyes finding the small, quiet woman who was now being helped out of the simulator by a stunned technician. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. The unwinnable scenario wasn't a hypothetical. It was a reconstruction. It was a memory pulled from a classified flight log. It was a Tuesday afternoon for the pilot known as Wraith. Admiral Thorne walked to the center of the room, his presence silencing the frantic whispers that had begun to erupt. His face was pale, his expression a mixture of awe and profound, retroactive fear for a pilot he had never met but whose legend he now understood. He faced the assembled squadron, the best and brightest of a new generation, and his gaze was hard as granite. He looked at Viper Jensen, whose face was a canvas of confusion and shattered pride. Lieutenant Commander Jensen, the Admiral's voice was low, but it cut through the silence like a blade. You asked this woman for her call sign as a joke. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle on the room. A mistake I imagine you will not be repeating. You, and every other pilot in this room, have been operating under a series of catastrophic assumptions. He gestured toward Evelyn, who was now sipping a cup of water, her composure as serene as ever. You assumed her age meant she was weak. You assumed her gender meant she was incapable. You assumed her civilian clothes meant she was ignorant of our world. You were wrong on every conceivable level. The Admiral took a deep breath, his voice resonating with the authority of his rank and the gravity of his discovery. This is Evelyn Reed. In the 1960s and 70s, she was a lead test pilot for the classified Project Chimera. She flew aircraft that were barely more than engines with wings, machines so unstable and dangerous that most of them try to kill their pilots on a daily basis. She flew prototypes that some of you have only read about in textbooks, and some you never will, because their failures were buried for national security. He let his eyes sweep over the young, shocked faces. The F/31 Wyvern you all just failed to land? Its flight control software, the very core of its fly-by-wire system, is based on algorithms derived from data she collected during her test flights. The emergency procedures you follow when your own aircraft fails, she wrote half of them. She wrote them in her own blood, sweat, and terror. After surviving the very failures they are designed to prevent, he turned back to Evelyn, and for the first time, the hard lines of his face softened into an expression of pure, unadulterated respect. He stood ramrod straight, brought his hand up in a sharp, perfect salute, and held it. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "it is an honor. Forgive the ignorance of this generation. They have forgotten the giants whose shoulders they stand on." The gesture was a thunderclap, an admiral saluting a civilian. It was a reversal of the entire military order, a public declaration of a hierarchy that transcended rank, the hierarchy of pure, undeniable, and legendary competence. The call sign he didn't say out loud hung in the air, more powerful for being unspoken. Wraith. The story of what happened in the simulator bay did not just spread through the USS Vigilance. It detonated. It traveled at the speed of gossip, moving from the flight deck to the mess halls, from the engine rooms to the intelligence centers, a wildfire of awe and disbelief. Sailors who had seen the quiet old woman walking the passageways now stopped and stared, whispering her name, or the name the Admiral had not said aloud but that everyone now knew: Wraith. The legend took root instantly, embellished with each telling. Some said she had landed the simulator with her eyes closed. Others swore the engineers had checked the code and found that her flight had actually broken the simulation's physics engine, forcing it to create a new outcome. The tale became a modern myth, a parable for a new age of warfare. It was the story of the quiet professional, the unassuming master who reminded an entire crew that the most dangerous weapon is not the one that makes the most noise, but the one that possesses the calmest center. The impact on the Saints of War squadron was immediate and profound. The swagger and arrogance that had defined their culture evaporated overnight, replaced by a quiet, focused humility. The ready room, once a place of loud jokes and boasting, became a space for studious, sober reflection. They pored over old flight manuals, studying the history of aviation with a newfound reverence, realizing they were just the latest chapter in a long and storied saga. The most dramatic transformation was in Lieutenant Commander Viper Jensen. The public shattering of his ego did not break him. It remade him. The arrogance was burned away, leaving behind the core of a good officer who had been led astray by his own pride. A few days after the incident, he found Evelyn in the ship's library, where she was quietly reading a book on astrophysics. He didn't offer a clumsy, wordy apology. He knew that words were his weakness, the tools of his former arrogance. Instead, he approached her, stood at a respectful distance, and simply came to the position of attention, his back straight, his eyes fixed forward. He stood there in silence for a full minute. It was a gesture of profound respect, a nonverbal admission of his error, and a plea for a different kind of instruction. Evelyn looked up from her book, her pale blue eyes meeting his. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. The apology was accepted. The lesson had been learned. He had finally understood that competence is a language spoken in action, not assertion, and that true respect is earned in the silence between heartbeats, in the crucible of a crisis where only skill remains. The legend of Wraith became more than just a story. It became a part of the carrier's operational DNA. Viper Jensen, with Evelyn's quiet encouragement, began to change the squadron's training doctrine. He instituted new programs focused not on aggressive maneuvering or tactical flair, but on what he called systems empathy, the ability to understand and feel an aircraft's limits, to listen to the machine instead of just commanding it. He used the recording of Evelyn's simulator flight as the ultimate teaching tool. He would play it for new pilots, pointing out the quiet efficiency of her movements, the utter lack of panic, the way she solved a dozen problems at once through calm, methodical action. The high-tech Aegis 6 simulator, where she had performed the impossible, was officially renamed by the crew. A small, unofficially made brass plaque appeared on its hatch one morning, engraved with simple words. The Wraith has purged the command structure. From the Admiral down, wisely chose to let it remain. It became a touchstone, a physical reminder of the day their world was turned upside down. Pilots would touch the plaque for good luck before entering the simulator, a small ritual of respect for the ghost who had schooled them all. Evelyn Reed stayed aboard the Vigilance for another week, not as a consultant, but as a mentor. She never gave a lecture or a formal briefing. Instead, she would sit in on debriefs, speaking only rarely, but when she did, her words were delivered with a precision that cut to the heart of any issue. She taught the pilots to value silence, to find clarity in the moments between the chaos. She spoke of the sky not as a battlefield, but as a presence, a vast and unforgiving entity that respected calm and punished panic. Her philosophy was simple. The mission is not about you. It is not about your ego, your reputation, or your call sign. It is about bringing the machine home, and the machine will tell you how if you are quiet enough to listen. Her presence transformed the saints of war. They flew with a new maturity, a quiet competence that made them more effective, more lethal, and safer than ever before. The legend was no longer just a story about a single event. It was a living, breathing ethos, a code of conduct passed down from a master to a new generation. Months later, the USS Vigilance was on station in the turbulent waters of the South China Sea. The lessons taught by Evelyn Reed were about to be tested not by simulation, but by the brutal reality of a mid-air crisis. A young pilot, Lieutenant Suds McAllister, one of the newest members of the squadron, was on a routine patrol when a catastrophic electrical fire erupted in his F/18. His cockpit filled with acrid smoke. His displays flickered and died, leaving him blind and disoriented. The same calm, computerized voice that had haunted the simulator now screamed in his ear. Warning, avionics bay fire. Warning, multiple flight control failures. Eject, 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 panic, cold and sharp, seized him. His hand instinctively reached for the ejection handle. But then, through the smoke and fear, a memory surfaced. He saw the recording of Evelyn's flight. He heard Viper's voice in the debrief. She ignored the noise. She listened to the plane. Suds pulled his hand back from the handle. He took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the panic down. He stopped fighting. He closed his eyes for a second, blocking out the screaming lights and the useless, dead screens. He focused on the feel of the aircraft through his control stick, through the soles of his boots. He felt the sluggishness, The way the airframe shuddered, the subtle shifts in pressure. He was listening. He remembered the story of a wraith, the pilot who could coax life back into dead machines. He began working the problem, not from the checklist he couldn't see, but from a place of pure, intuitive airmanship he never knew he possessed. He manually rerouted power, performed a side slip to scrub off speed, and aimed the nose of his crippled bird towards the distant silhouette of the carrier. He flew by the lessons of a ghost. When his damaged fighter jet, trailing smoke and flying on a prayer, slammed onto the flight deck and caught the wire, the cheer that erupted from the crew was deafening. He had saved a $90 million aircraft and his own life. Later, in the debriefing, a shaken but triumphant Suds McAllister was asked by Admiral Thorne how he managed it. The young pilot looked at his commanding officer, Viper Jensen, and then at the Admiral. "I just did what the Wraith would have done, sir," he said simply. "I stayed calm, and I listened. The legacy was now complete. It was no longer a story or a plaque on a simulator. It was a skill, a life-saving instinct that had been passed from one generation to the next. The quiet competence of a single, unassuming woman had become the official doctrine of the Saints of War, a permanent part of their soul. True legacy isn't an inscription on a monument or a name in a history book. It is not what you leave behind in a static, marble form, but what continues to move forward in the actions of others." Evelyn Wraith Reed's contribution was not the single, shocking demonstration of her skill, but the enduring ripple effect of her quiet professionalism. Her triumph was not over Viper Jensen's arrogance, but over the very idea that worth is measured by volume, that strength is synonymous with swagger. She reminded an entire carrier strike group, and all who heard her story, that the most profound impact is often made by those who seek no credit, who require no applause, and whose confidence is so deeply seated that it needs no external validation. The story of her visit became a foundational myth for every new pilot who joined the squadron, a mandatory piece of their indoctrination. It served as a permanent inoculation against the disease of ego, a reminder that there are always giants in the world, and they rarely look the part. The pilot you dismissed today might be the one who wrote the book you live by. The quiet observer in the corner might be the master of your craft. Competence does not announce itself. It simply is. And in the face of true, demonstrated competence, all assumptions are rendered meaningless. All arrogance is revealed as ignorance. And all that is left is the humbling, beautiful, and undeniable truth of the deed itself. The lesson of the Wraith was that the ultimate power lies not in the ability to command the storm, but in the discipline to become the calm at its center. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent professionalism defines true worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.